Today, I'm answering a question that I often get, and that is, what is intuitive eating really? And there are lots of opinions about this, probably from people with varying degrees of actual knowledge of intuitive eating. Unfortunately, I think because it's so beautifully, simply named, people think they understand what it is without really understanding. And so intuitive eating is a model of working with your relationship with food that's based on listening to your body to drive your interpretations and your responses and how to take care of yourself. It was developed in the 90s by two dietitians, Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, and they released their first edition of intuitive eating in 1995 when I was still at Penn State and not at all aware of it, but needed it, definitely needed it. And it is a very different way of relating to food than what many of us were taught. There are 10 principles of intuitive eating, and I'm not going to get into each specific principle this time. There will be other videos that talk about the specific principles and their nuances and what they really mean and what it means to work with them long term. But for today, what I want to cover is really just the core view and values of intuitive eating. Many people think intuitive eating is, just listen to your body and do everything in moderation. This is a vast oversimplification of intuitive eating. Yes, it's about listening to your body, but there's a lot that goes into how you listen to your body. So one way of thinking about this is to look at the criteria that have been used to study intuitive eating. So when scientists look at whether a style of eating is useful for body image or recovery from eating disorders, they have to specify specific characteristics of that approach so they know who's practicing it and who's not. So there originally were three main characteristics for intuitive eating, and then a fourth one was added later. So the first one is eating primarily for physical reasons. And so that means that for the most part, when you're eating, it's because you're physically hungry. You physically need something. And you're feeding your body calories, carbs, protein, fat in order to meet your bodily needs. Okay, that's number one. The second one is that you give yourself unconditional permission to eat. And what unconditional permission means is that there's no more good and bad foods. There's no more healthy and unhealthy foods. There's no foods that are safe and those that are off limits. All foods are looked at on the same moral plane. All foods are just some combination of protein, carb, and fat. And there's no moral judgment. There's no right or wrong to what you choose to eat. So this has the effect often of relieving us of the tension and the pressure and the anxiety and the paranoia of eating the right way. And I'll get into this a little bit more in a sec. The third one is to have ways of dealing with emotions that don't involve food. And this really speaks to the tendency that many of us have to use food in a way to modify our emotional lives. And it could be to amp up the pleasure that we're experiencing, and it could also be to soothe or distract from discomfort that we're feeling. So eating primarily for physical reasons, giving yourself unconditional permission to eat, and having ways of dealing with emotions that don't involve food, this tends to give you a different orientation to food. Yes, food is fuel, but it's also a source of enjoyment and connection and celebration and all these other things. So it doesn't have to be perfect. And what's right doesn't come down to somebody's judgment of what's healthy and what's not healthy. What's right comes down to what are you feeling in any given moment and what do you actually need? And so some of the things that people run into when they start to work with these three principles are mistaking intuitive eating for the eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full diet, for example. So that if they are eating beyond comfortable fullness, if they're eating to soothe, if they're eating for fun, that's somehow doing intuitive eating wrong. That's not the way we think about it. Giving yourself unconditional permission to eat is also something that's very often misinterpreted. This does not mean you eat whatever you want, whenever you want it, in whatever amount you feel like on a whim. This is really about working with the subtleties and the complexities of your own needs and to release the judgment about what you're eating. Sometimes I liken this to having a tug of war, because so often when we're dealing with food and how we relate to it, how we make choices around it, we feel like we're having this internal conflict, and that we're in a tug of war against ourselves or against whatever's supposed to be right. And inevitably, when there's a right and a wrong, we feel conflicted because we have this strong sense of autonomy that wants to do what it wants to do. So if you tell me that you can't have blue cheese while you're pregnant, I'm going to want blue cheese while I'm pregnant. And so if you give yourself unconditional permission to eat then, and you're eating primarily for physical reasons, then the way you make choices is more moment to moment. It's, okay, I want a ham sandwich. Am I hungry? Yeah, I'm hungry. Is that what I feel like will be satisfying? Yeah. Am I going to judge myself because I'm having this ingredient or this ingredient? That's up to me. That has to do with my personal satisfaction. So I get to make those choices. Because when I eat in this way, I tend to eat a variety over time so that my needs can be met. I don't need to micromanage everything. So then the third piece of it, having ways of dealing with emotions that don't involve food, is really important because we often use food to change our emotions. But this doesn't mean that food can never be used to soothe emotions. So it's sort of the rules are there are no rules, but there are these really solid supportive principles to keep in mind so that you start to ask yourself the right questions in order to move closer and closer to what's true for you in any given moment. Years after those three criteria were introduced, a fourth criterion was brought into it, and that is that there is a congruence between your food choices and how your body feels as a result. It's called body-food congruence or food-body congruence. And what that means is that the food that you choose to eat is both good as you're eating it and it feels good in your body. And this can be a for the most part thing as well, but the example I often use is around lactose intolerance, because there's not really the same moral judgment around lactose intolerance that there can be around other chronic health conditions where food choice might be affected. So with lactose intolerance, if you eat foods that contain lactose like cheese or ice cream or milk, you might have GI disruption. You might have gas, you might have bloating, you might have diarrhea, things like that. And so when you approach lactose, if you're lactose intolerant from a food-body congruence standpoint, then you make the choice that allows your body to feel the best. For most people, that tends to mean that they choose not to have foods that cause this GI distress, unless they can pop like a lactate pill or something like that, and they can relieve the distress. In some cases, though, if you're at your favorite ice cream place, you might decide, oh, you know what, I'm gonna have it and I'm just gonna stay close to the bathroom this afternoon. But for the most part, we're making choices that feel good in our bodies. Now, when you're early on in exploring intuitive eating, it's hard to not see these characteristics as rules, because that's what we know. We know rules around dieting. And so, of course, we're going to interpret it as only eat when you're physically hungry. And then that seems to conflict with this idea of unconditional permission to eat, because that seems to say you can eat whenever you want. And having other ways of dealing with emotions that don't involve food. Oh, does that mean that I'm not supposed to use food to work with feelings? Or the fourth criterion of food-body congruence, does this mean that I can't have the foods that are not good for me from the standpoint of my specific physical needs or medical condition or something like that. But there's a lot of nuance within each of these things. And so what these characteristics tend to do is to help us understand what the general framework is within intuitive eating that we're working with in order to make the choices that feel best for us. But they fall short of being specific, hard, fast rules. At the beginning of the process, it's normal to be a little rigid and confused around some of these things. And what I would say to do is to just keep practicing, keep trying, keep feeding yourself regularly, keep prioritizing satisfaction and pleasure in what you're eating. Keep exploring ways to support yourself beyond just your biology, your emotional needs. As you move through time, as you do this practice and you collect data from the results that you have, you can fine-tune over time. And then for those of us who are a little further down the path, we can use these characteristics to just check in with ourselves. For the most part, am I eating according to my physical needs? You know what? That's shifted in the last couple of months, and I find myself eating more when I'm not hungry. What's going on there, right? What might it look and feel like to start shifting it back in the direction of, for the most part, eating according to physical reasons? That might mean, it probably means that there are some emotional needs that are not being met, or there's some other things that have changed in my situation, whether it's in my body, my environment, my world, that are provoking this different way of relating to food. And the truth about this process, and why I say that this is the last thing you ever have to really learn. You don't have to learn all the new diet rules, because this is not a diet. This is a framework. This is a model that teaches you to ask the right questions. Your body's going to continue to change, right? Your needs are going to continue to change, whether it's your needs for calories or your needs for protein or your needs for certain nutrients or the way you can tolerate certain ingredients. That's all going to change. And so these characteristics give you the basic information for noticing those changes as they happen. Of course, from my perspective, I love to couple this with meditation and mindfulness, because that just trains us to pay attention in a much more attuned way. But these characteristics really help us as we mature as intuitive eaters to keep refining and to keep making the adjustments necessary to continue meeting our needs. Okay? So if somebody tells you, oh, intuitive eating is just another diet, they don't know what they're talking about. Oh, intuitive eating, that's just about eating whatever you want whenever you want it. That's also not what it's about, okay? Go on intuitiveeating.org and learn about it from the creators, explore my page, and learn about what it really is, including some of the subtleties of the different principles. And again, I'll talk about this in future videos. But most of all, start to engage with these practices in your own life and see how your own wisdom starts to come out. Your own preferences start to come out. Your own opinions start to come out. Because you have everything that you need to be an intuitive eater. And this supporting information can just help you refine it so that you make it your own. And if you find this video or any other video helpful, please share it. My goal is really to make intuitive eating and mindfulness and meditation just universally available to people, and so that there's not a paywall between learning how to apply these teachings in your life. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.